02 626 4898.
Now History on Book TV features James Loewen on his book Lies Across America, What Our Historic Sites Get Wrong. The former sociology and race relations professor traveled across the country researching the history behind historical monuments, houses, markers, forts, and ships. In 100 essays, he corrects historical errors and raises questions about what our nation chooses to remember and how. His appearance at a Washington, D.C. bookstore is about an hour.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you all for coming out this evening. People ask me, well, what caused you to get so interested in historical monuments and historic sites? And it possibly grew out of a little research finding that I found, I guess that's what you do with findings, when I was studying the material that I used for Lies My Teacher Told Me. I learned that something like 14 or 15% of all Americans ever take a course in history once they leave high school. And of course, since what I studied was high school history textbooks, and I found that they did a rather dreadful job and erroneous job in many cases of teaching American history, that concerned me. So I thought, well, where do folks learn about American history if they don't take it in college? Of course, some folks don't go to college, and if they do, they avoid history, many, because of their boring high school history courses. Well, if you were like my family, my dad stopped the family car at every darn historical monument and marker that we ever passed on our family vacation trips. And we stopped at all too many history museums and historical houses and forts and ships and so on. And I think that's true across the country, that people go to historic sites and they try to learn about the past. And Dad thought that he was educating us, but it seems to me, having done more research on this subject, that often he was miseducating us. And I want to give you some examples tonight, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion maybe. In order to write this book, I seem to have engaged in a masochistic enterprise, just like I did for Lies My Teacher Told Me. For Lies My Teacher Told Me, I read intensively 12 American history high school textbooks. I don't think any previous American had ever subjected himself to such an enterprise, to such torture. It was so boring. This time I attempted to read all of the state historical markers in the United States. Now there's 500,000 historical markers in all, counting, you know, the little ones put up by towns, put up by churches, put up by all kinds of things. Of state historical markers, however, there's not that many. It was perhaps a manageable task, except I got defeated by 2 states. And you might think about the character of these states. It perhaps relates to the defeat that I suffered. The first defeat was in Texas. Texas, it turns out, has 12,000 historical markers, state historical markers. I pointed out to them that this was about as many as the rest of the United States combined. And they replied, well, yes. Implying, of course, we've had more history than the rest of the United States combined. I also did the math. I realized that if I spent exactly 1 minute reading every historical marker in Texas, the task would take me over 6 weeks. And that's not giving a lot of thought to those markers, that's just reading them for a minute. So I didn't read them all in Texas, although I did end up reading quite a few of them. The other state that defeated me was New Jersey. I went to the State House in Trenton. I found the office and the man who's in charge of historical markers in New Jersey, and I said, well, can I look at your files? And he said, well, he was quite embarrassed. He said, no, about 10 or 15 years ago, we lost the files. So maybe that fits with your image of New Jersey, maybe not, I don't know. But in any case, I said to him, well, if a snowplow hits one, how do you put it back up? And he said, well, they have to bring in the pieces, or else we don't know what it said. So the only way to read them all in New Jersey is to drive the entire state, and I failed to do that, although I did find something in every state to write an entry about. This new book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, is in the form of 100 short entries. There's at least one on every state showing something that is drastically wrong with some historical site in that state and in the District of Columbia. Well, let me give you a couple of examples. Probably more than a couple. First one will be from Texas, and this was a marker I did read. It is about the invention of the airplane in Texas. Okay, now, you may be under the misapprehension that the airplane was invented by the Wright brothers. In Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, they flew it for the first time in 1903. But the state of Texas has an official state historical marker, lovely thing in bronze or aluminum or whatever, that says not so. It is in Pittsburgh, Texas, a small town east of Dallas, and it tells us that in 1902, a whole year before the Wright brothers, the Reverend Burrell Cannon, a Baptist minister, got together 25 people who donated $1,000 each, and he developed what he called the Ezekiel Airship. He named it the Ezekiel Airship because he got his plans, he said, from the book of Ezekiel in the Bible. Something about a roaring of wings and a rushing of winds, or the other way around, I forget, which he said had the complete blueprints for an airship. So if you go to downtown metropolitan Pittsburgh to this day and you eat in the only restaurant in downtown Pittsburgh, you will see a full-size model of this airship. It's a beautiful airship done by the Optimist Club, and I saw it, and it has it is paddled by, if you will, it is lifted by 4 vertically mounted paddle wheels in front of and behind the pilot, and then there's some wings going out. Now, paddle wheels work great on a steamboat because there's a difference between water and not water. And so the paddle goes this way and drives the water backwards and drives the ship forwards, and then it comes back in the air. I think a moment's reflection will convince you that in air, it doesn't work so well. The paddle goes down and generates a whole bunch of lift, and it goes this way and generates some forward motion. And unfortunately, it then goes this way and eliminates all the lift, and then it goes this way and eliminates the forward motion. And so this airship, I can guarantee you, never got off the ground. But Texas says it did. Okay, well, that's kind of funny. There's another marker in rural Wisconsin that says that here the automobile was first invented. The heck with the Mercedes-Benz people and somebody in France who probably invented well, it's hard to say what is the first automobile, but I can tell you it didn't start in Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin State Historical Society is merely embarrassed by this official state marker, and they'd like to take it down, but the people in the community like it, so they can't get it down. Then there's a marker in Idaho that's really even funnier in one sense, but also more tragic. And let me read it to you. This is in Almo, Idaho. And it's a beautiful marker. I have a picture of it in the book. It's a piece of slate carved in the shape of the state of Idaho, which is not a simple matter. We're not talking Colorado here. And the words go as follows. Almo, Idaho, dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives in a horrible Indian massacre, 1861. 300 immigrants westbound, only 5 escaped. Erected by S&D of Idaho Pioneers, 1938. S&D is, of course, the sons and daughters of Idaho Pioneers. Now, this is quite an event. 300 dead is actually considerably more than General George Armstrong Custer lost at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Montana. It turns out, however, 300 people were not killed in this horrible massacre. 30 people were not killed in this massacre. 3 people were not killed in this massacre. In fact, it's not easy to prove that something didn't happen. It's much easier to prove positives. But a historian whom I've read the research of and spent decades of his life proving that this event never happened at all, no people were ever killed. This teaches us that every historical marker, every monument, every house, museum, every antebellum plantation, whatever, is a story of at least 2 times. In this case, it's supposedly a story about 1861 when this massacre happened, and also it's a story about 1938 when the marker went up. But in this case, it's only a story about 1938 because the massacre never happened. So that's kind of cute, and it really drills that lesson home. Again, the Idaho State Historical Society is not happy with this marker. They've tried to get Almo to take it down, but the people in Almo will not hear of it because it's the biggest event that ever happened in Almo, even though it never happened in Almo. And my picture of it shows it all decorated with Christmas lights for Christmas time because they are so happy with it. Well, let's see. Where do we go from there? Well, I wanted to emphasize that there's also a terminological problem with that marker and with lots and lots of historical markers and monuments. In that case, the word massacre, of course. And let me ask you a question. How many dead white people do you think it takes to have a massacre? What do you think? Shout it out.
Apparently 0.
Well, that's the best answer I've heard. You're right, 0. Okay. I've been one-upped. I guess I shouldn't ask that question directly after talking about that marker. You're right. All right. I was going to say that the answer is 1, because it turns out there are 2 historical markers at least in the United States, one in Pennsylvania, I believe, and one in Florida, that talk about a massacre when 1 person was killed. In the Florida case, they talk about the Bradley Massacre, which when you read the fine print is the killing by the Seminole Indians during the Seminole Wars of a Captain Bradley. But this gets to be called the Bradley Massacre. And then we have the contrary question. How many Indians, dead Indians, does it take to have a massacre? You want to try that one? Anybody? What? The answer, I'm not sure I heard you. What?
Oh, I was saying maybe they wouldn't consider it a massacre,
No,
no matter
no,
how many were killed.
That's right. That's right. Or another way of putting it is we don't know yet. We have what's called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in southern Alabama of the Creek Indians, which killed something like 900 Indians at the cost of, I think, a handful, if that, of attackers' lives. The attackers were both white and Choctaw Indians, too. But that's the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And one of the places that's on the landscape that's very interesting is at Wounded Knee. Now, Wounded Knee, you may remember it, 1890 is sometimes called the last battle of the Indian West, but it wasn't a battle either. The Dakota Indians in that area had surrendered. They were under the watch, under the guard, really, of the United States Cavalry, which had them surrounded and had 2 different Gatling guns, Hotchkiss guns anyway, form of machine gun aimed down at them. And in the disarming process the next morning, somebody fired a gun. We don't know who fired the first shot. I don't think it hit anybody. It may have been an Indian. The result was attacks, guns shot down into the camp. People fled in all directions, and some very tragic smaller events happened, including the murder of all kinds of clearly unarmed civilians, women and children in a ditch, very, very similar to the My Lai massacre almost a century later in Vietnam. Well, that was called, on the landscape, the Battle of Wounded Knee. And 10 or 15 years ago, someone, probably Sioux or Lakota Indian, replaced the word battle with the word massacre on both sides of the sign. This is a green and white sign. It's a wooden sign, as they use in the West often. He did a perfect job. You have to come right up to it and examine it carefully to see that any kind of change was made. And the state of South Dakota has left it alone. So it now says the massacre of Wounded Knee rather than the battle. Well, there's other terminology problems that slip by people. For instance, discover. You can guess that problem. We've just been past Columbus Day. But all over the United States, white folks discover lakes. Sometimes they're lakes that have clearly Indian names still, implying that maybe some Indian helped them visit the lake rather than discover it. But the markers say they discovered it. All of the Great Lakes, for instance, have markers discovered by whites, and so on. Well, another problematic word is menace, and another one is squaw. Terms like Squaw Lake and Squaw Tits Mountain in Arizona are deservedly offensive to Native Americans. And another one that I hadn't thought about until I was doing the research for this book, Lies Across America, is the word devil, as in Devil's Lake, or Devil's Tower, or Devil's Peaks. All across America, whenever you see that word, typically it refers to a site that is a sacred site of the Native people. And the, shall we say, super Christian initial white explorers in the area were outraged by them and would convert them then to Devil's Lake, whereas the Indians would prefer in English Spirit Lake, and so on across the country. Well, I want to say a couple other things, and then we'll take some questions. Besides the terms, there's also the words that are left out, and I'll comment briefly on something in D.C., since we're in D.C. We have the Jefferson Memorial. Not my favorite memorial, far from it. When you go over to the Jefferson Memorial, you will see 4 panels of Jefferson's writings surrounding the tall statue of himself. And particularly the 3rd panel is a problem. There's some problems with one of the other panels, but the 3rd panel is Jefferson's writings, supposedly, on slavery and on education. And there's 3 dots all over the place. You know, the famous 3 dots that will put together 2 different sentences. And when you actually look at these sentences, it turns out that the 2 sentence phrases may be 20 years apart from each other, may be at cross purposes, but they're connected with these dots. Ellipses, I think, is the official term for these things. So you never know what's left out. And in my book, I try to put back in what's left out. And you learn then that Jefferson was not in favor of abolition, particularly decreasingly so as he became older, was he against slavery. And he particularly was not in favor of educating slaves or even free black people. So this is a memorial, and it's really a memorial run by the NPS, the National Park Service, that puts a false image out of Jefferson. And even when you go downstairs and you see the video about Jefferson, which is a brand new video, no fault, nothing wrong with Jefferson. Almost everything good that ever happened in the United States flowed somehow from this fount of wisdom. I might say, incidentally, that the Lincoln Memorial is quite different and has no dots, represents Lincoln's words fairly on its walls, and also the video downstairs is quite effective, talks about the Lincoln Memorial over time, and not just the high points, such as the famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King, but also what might be some more notorious points, such as the point when Vietnam veterans against the war took over the memorial and held it for some hours as a protest against the Vietnam War. So it tells that story too, warts and all. So there are some good sites across the country. Besides the little dots problem, there are some bigger omissions. I bring out several in Lies Across America. One of them, for instance, is Scottsboro, Alabama. I don't know how many of you know what happened in Scottsboro, but Scottsboro, for about 10 years really, was world famous. This little town in Alabama was famous for the Scottsboro case, often called the Scottsboro Boys, which were a batch of about 8 or maybe 9 young African-American males who were riding the rails, who were, you know, hobos on the railroad, along with a couple of white kids, in fact, several white kids. They got in an argument, and apparently the whites started it, actually. The black kids threw rocks at the white kids because the white kids had started by throwing rocks at them. And the result was that these black kids were arrested, finally, for the rape of 2 white women who were on the train. It's a long story. It went on for 10 years. People were sentenced to death for this rape that never happened, incidentally. We absolutely, again, have proof that the rape never happened. But the defendants were sentenced to death as many as 4 different times. This case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It became world famous. There were protests about it in Latin America, in France. You go to Scottsboro today, there are 4 historical markers in downtown Scottsboro, including around the courthouse where this event initially took place, where the first trial happened. None of them mentions the event that made Scottsboro famous. So this is an example of what gets left off the landscape in too many places across America. Too many towns are famous for one major event, but they don't talk about it. And you can't learn about it if you just look at the landscape. Well, sometimes it's worse than omission. Sometimes the landscape is in direct denial. And so there's various examples of that in Lies Across America. I'll mention just 2 right now, and they both have to do with sexual orientation. If you visit the Willa Cather homestead in Nebraska, where she grew up, she is an obviously lesbian writer, according to all kinds of commentators and professors of English, and her biographer. And you ask, was she lesbian? You get a flat denial. No, she was not, despite the fact that the bookstore carries books arguing that, of course, she was. And I personally went to Buchanan's house, that is James Buchanan, not Pat, President James Buchanan's house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and asked after the tour, was he gay? Quote, no, he was not. Buchanan was gay, or at least Buchanan was homosexual. There's some people argue you shouldn't use the word gay in the 19th century because it's anachronistic. I don't know about that. And in both of these cases, Buchanan and Cather, it mattered. That is, it mattered to their work. In the case of Buchanan, for instance, his long-term lover was the senator from Alabama, a right-wing pro-slavery senator who in fact owned slaves, and who influenced Buchanan, surely, politically, because Buchanan became a member of, in fact, even a tool of, the pro-slavery wing of the Democratic Party throughout the 1840s and 50s. Even though he came from Lancaster County, which is full of Mennonites and Quakers, some of the most anti-slavery people in the country, and his own church, which was a Presbyterian church, disbarred him from fellowship because of his pro-slavery views. So how do you explain this? Well, the Buchanan Homestead doesn't try to. They simply say, when I asked them, how did he feel about slavery? They said, he was against it. All of the people in this area were. Well, they're right about all of the people in the area. They're wrong about Buchanan. They're in denial. Well, let's see. Finally, a couple of other errors. These are not exactly errors of denial. They're errors of commission, sins of commission. And I think I'll just deal with one today, and that is Confederate monuments. Confederate monuments are all over the place, of course, all across America, north as well as south. My entry on Confederate monuments and memorials is one of the longer entries in the book, and I cite it in Helena, Montana. Now you might say, where there's a beautiful fountain and big thing, and it says, for our Confederate dead. And you might say, gee, I didn't know there were any Confederate dead in Helena, Montana. And of course, there weren't any Confederate dead in Helena, Montana. In fact, there weren't any Union dead in Helena, Montana, because during the Civil War, there was no Montana. I mean, Montana was invented as a territory in 1864, after all. And it was still Indian country as late as 1876, when George Armstrong Custer had a little trouble with the Indians up at what's called the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and that was in Montana. So how come there's a monument to our Confederate dead in Helena, Montana? Well, again, we have to look at when it went up. And it went up in about 1913. And at that time, that's between maybe 1890 and 1920, what many historians call the nadir, or low point, of American history. Well, the low point of race relations in American history. And during this time, the Confederacy really won the Civil War. And they won it in several ways. One of the ways they won it is they won it on the landscape. And they put up Confederate monuments all across the country to indicate this. They also won it in terms of terminology. And it became, during that time period, and to some extent to this day, the war between the states. It was never called the war between the states while it was being fought. It was called the Civil War, or sometimes the War of the Rebellion. And that's why the Confederates were called rebels. They also won it in that time period by defining what it was about, and it was supposedly about states' rights, which it wasn't. Anyway, it isn't just Helena, Montana, then. Another example of this problem is right here, or almost right here, just north of here. The county just north of here is Montgomery County, Maryland, and at the courthouse is a rather beautiful Confederate monument. It's in Rockville. It says something like, do not forget to love the thin gray line. Okay, so this is a statement in 1910 or 1915. We must remember and love the Confederacy in Maryland. Now, Maryland did not secede. Maryland, in fact, this county in Maryland, probably sent more people by far to the U.S. armies than to the Confederate armies. But they are forgotten on the landscape. And another example of that is Kentucky. The entire state of Kentucky did not secede, you will remember. It did send 30,000 or so troops to the Confederacy, but it sent 90,000 troops to the U.S. Okay, today it has 73 Civil War monuments. 2 of them are for the Union and 71 for the Confederacy. So the Confederacy now holds Kentucky, which it was never able to hold during the Civil War. And it makes a difference, and I argue in Lies Across America that this is not just, oh, who cares about those old monuments anyway? It makes a difference. It makes a difference to people's conduct, even today, or just yesterday, in Kentucky. Well, I want to close by asking you guys a question. In all of the United States, who do you think would get the most markers and monuments in one state? I mean, would it be Abraham Lincoln in Illinois, say? Or who do you think? Anybody?
Jefferson in Virginia.
Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. That makes sense. No. It's a trick question, of course, but that's a good guess. No. Any other guesses?
What about George Washington?
George Washington in Virginia. That's even a better guess because he gets all these monuments that say, you know, or markers anyway. George Washington spent the night here, you know, and so on. Let me digress, in fact, for a minute and tell you that the most hilarious George Washington monument or marker comes from New York State. And I think I'll read it to you since he's come up. It's very, very short. And then I'll tell you who does get the most markers and monuments in one state. Here we go. This is way up in the town of Alabama, New York, which is up in northern New York in Genesee County. And the marker says, put up in 1932, quote, fording place on Grand Central Trail, said to have been used by George Washington during the French and Indian War. So here we have a place across a creek that George Washington walked. And he did, it turns out. But it wasn't that George Washington. It was a different George Washington, who furthermore turns out to have been a Native American who lived up there, and he walked across this creek, which I think, and this has been brought to the attention of the state of New York, they leave the marker up. This opens up an entire new area for historical markers, if you think about it. I mean, it turns out that there is right now in Seattle 4 different people, at least, named John Adams, the second president. Okay, so they could have historical markers. It just wouldn't be that John Adams, right? In central Mississippi, there's a professor called John Quincy Adams, and he's a professor of political science even. So he could have a marker, you know, John Quincy Adams got divorced here, you know, or whatever, you know. Lyndon B. Johnson lives in Southgate, California. I looked him up. And so on. There are at least 24 George Washingtons alive in the United States today. So we can have all kinds of new historical markers that we haven't ever thought of, you know. George Washington indicted for income tax evasion here in Reno, Nevada, or whatever, you know. Okay. If there is one in Reno, I take it back. I didn't mean it. All right. Who gets the most historical markers? It isn't Washington in Virginia. It isn't Robert E. Lee in Virginia, which would be a sadder choice, but... And it isn't Jefferson Davis, that would be in Mississippi, say, that would be a sad choice, but it is worse than any of those, actually. It is. The person who gets the most historical markers and monuments in one state is none other than Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee. Now, who was Nathan Bedford Forrest? He was, of course, the first national leader of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. Before then, during the Civil War, he was the Confederate general whose men committed the notorious Fort Pillow massacre, killing surrendered troops, black and white, at Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River in Tennessee. That's one of his historical markers, and of course it denies that there was a massacre. Before the Civil War, he was a slave trader, and he even brought slaves directly from Africa in the 1850s to the United States, although that trade had been outlawed by an act of Congress in 1808. So this is the man who gets more historical markers and monuments than anyone else in the United States. This is why sometimes I talk in this book about we live in a landscape of white supremacy. One of the markers is so inconsequential, it actually says, Forrest rested here. I mean, even George Washington had to spend the night or ford a stream, you know, do something more than just rest. It's absurd. Well, I'm going to close with a little encore, I guess. You haven't applauded yet, but an encore about toppling. My book closes with an appendix that lists 20 candidates for toppling. Markers and monuments that I suggest are so outrageous that something needs to be done about them. I do suggest toppling in quotes, that is, that we can do something more interesting than just remove them. We can take them to a museum and put appropriate labels on them, like this Almo massacre monument in Idaho. I'd hate to see that just destroyed. It deserves to go into a museum somewhere where it becomes a commentary on 1938. It has nothing to teach us about 1861. Well, toppling. I tried to find out what is the most toppled monument in the United States. Now, Americans are all fired up for toppling when it takes place in Poland, you know, or Russia. These topplings of Lenin and Stalin and the KGB heads and so on have met with nothing but our approval. But in terms of toppling in the United States, the last toppling we really talk about is the toppling of the statue of King George III in Manhattan, which happened during the Revolution. And he not only got toppled, he got melted down by the good ladies of Connecticut into bullets for the patriot cause, or at least that's apparently what happened. What is the most toppled statue in the United States? I think it's Haymarket, the statue to the Haymarket event. You remember the Haymarket event? This was in Chicago in 1886. Led by socialists and anarchists, these workers were demonstrating for that far-out left-wing concept called the 8-hour day. Now, ironically, Illinois already had a law guaranteeing the 8-hour day, had been passed in 1869 by the Republicans, but it wasn't being enforced. So they wanted it enforced. So they demonstrated in a huge parade on May 1st, 1886. And this is where we get May 1st as May Day or Labor Day throughout the world, everywhere but in the United States and Canada, where Labor Day is in the fall. You can think about that one for a minute. But they had this huge parade. A day or so later, they had another demonstration, this time at the McCormick Reaper plant, which was a now International Harvester, which was a huge plant and which was on strike. And during this demonstration, police got upset, fired into the crowd to kill 2 people. That's not Haymarket yet, though. The Haymarket event was the next day, May 4th, 1886, when a crowd of people assembled in Haymarket Square and listened to speeches condemning the murder of the 2 people the day before at the McCormick Reaper plant. The speeches went on, as speeches will do, and a light rain began to fall, and it became about 10 p.m., and the mayor visited the scene, and he declared it peaceable. By then, only a few hundred, 300 or 400 workers remained, and so he went to bed. And shortly thereafter, a lieutenant of police appeared on the scene with, I used to know this, I think 150 or so policemen behind him, and declared the scene unpeaceable. And he raised his right hand, and he said, "In the name of the people of Illinois, I command you disperse in peace." And just then, a bomb was thrown amongst the police, blew some of them up, and they opened fire, killing some other police, incidentally, but also killing some workers. And by the time, and everybody scattered in all directions. And that was the Haymarket riot, it's called, or Haymarket affair. 7 policemen lay dead. About 7 workers, we're not quite sure, lay dead. And there were dozens of wounded on each side. Well, 3 years later, Chicago erected a statue commemorating the event. And it was a statue of a big burly policeman with his hand up like this. And around the base it said, "In the name of the people of Illinois, I command peace." Okay, well, this statue stood in Haymarket Square for the next 11 years. And during this time, the workers weren't really excited about it because they said, "This is a little one-sided, you know. We'd like a statue too. We lost 7 of our people." And Chicago wouldn't allow them to commemorate the event anywhere within the city limits. So they eventually built a rather beautiful statue at Waldheim Cemetery in a western suburb just outside the city. But inside the city, nothing. So the statue of the policeman took a lot of abuse from workers. And finally, in 1900, the police said, "Well, we're tired of cleaning it up all the time and having it broken and paint on it and so on. We want it moved." So they moved it to Union Park. And there it sat until the 42nd anniversary to the day of the original event. And on that day, a streetcar left the track, trundled into the park, hit the statue, and toppled it. So that's the first toppling. Now, you might say, that was an act of God. But I found that somebody did an interview with the conductor, and he said, "I got so tired of him standing with his damn arm up." So apparently it wasn't an act of God. They moved the statue to a safer part of Union Park. And I don't call that a toppling, that's a removal. And there it stood until the 1950s. At this point, the police said, "Look, 7 of our brethren gave their lives in Haymarket Square. We want the statue back. So they put it back. By this time, Haymarket Square had been obliterated by the JFK Expressway, but they made a kind of little semicircle place for it, and they put it back, overlooking the expressway. Then, in 1968, yes, in 1968, a group called the Weathermen, remember them? Some of you will. That's a radical offshoot of Students for a Democratic Society. They blew up the statue, toppled it. They were upset with Chicago police because of events in 1968, including their behavior during the Democratic primary, Democratic National Convention. So they toppled the statue. That's the second toppling. Mayor Daley, a different Daley from today's Mayor Daley, but they're always Mayor Daley in Chicago, was outraged. He said this was an event that will outrage any right-thinking Chicagoan. And he had the legs recast and the statue put back up. 1 year later to the day, the same group, now calling itself the Weather Underground, so it's not sexist, blew it up again. Blew one of the legs onto the expressway, in fact, toppling it. Mayor Daley was outraged again. That's the third toppling. And they recast the statue again. Now, Chicago mounted a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day police guard. And I submit to you that in the entire history of law enforcement, this has to be the most boring assignment, to spend 8 hours watching a statue. I think even the donuts won't help. So after a few months of this, some of the columnists in Chicago pointed out that the Weathermen had immobilized a total of 5 policemen, because that's what it takes to mount such a watch, and a squad car, and it was costing the city thousands and thousands of dollars. So they moved the statue. I have a wonderful picture in the book of the statue with his arm up, being tilted a little bit and lifted up by a helicopter or a crane, I forget which. And they moved it indoors to where they thought it would be safe, in Central Police Headquarters. Okay? They left the base, and I went to visit it there just 4 or 5 years ago, only to find that it had been moved again. And the reason was, as the sergeant explained to me, they realized that in this era of Unabombers and such, that instead of making the statue safe by putting it in the police headquarters, they may have made themselves unsafe. So they put the statue back outdoors, but it is surrounded on all 4 sides by the Chicago Police Training Academy, and it's in an atrium. And in order to see it, you have to do as I did, sign yourself in at the desk, get escorted to the cafeteria, get let through the cafeteria and into the atrium, and then you can take its picture, which I did. Okay. I pointed out to them that it's still vulnerable to helicopter attack, but well, the base still stood, and I had heard, correctly, as it turned out, that a nearby parishioner had used it, why let it go to waste, for a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so I went to take a picture of her, only to find, when I got there, that she was gone, toppled, that's the 4th toppling, and that the base had been obliterated, so it can never be used again. Now, why? I talked with the official in charge, and it turned out that he was embarrassed by it all. And you might think, well, geez, there's statues of Our Lady all over the world, and there's certainly many statues of the Madonna in Chicago. But it did turn out that in all the world, this was the only statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary that said, "In the name of the people of Illinois, I command peace." So that's why it was an embarrassment, and that's why it was toppled. Well, that ended on a lighter note. I'm done. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to hear from you with some questions. Yes?
I have a question. In the bastion of the white supremacist behavior in this country, what interesting landmarks have you come across dedicated to the African-American experience in this country?
Interesting question. I've tried to decide what states have the best historical markers. And I've concluded that there's 3 states that stand out: Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Alabama. And with regard to treatment of African-American subjects, and what's sometimes called African-American history, although I would argue it is history, the 2 states that are the best are Pennsylvania and Alabama. Now, Pennsylvania is because of one man. And it's interesting, in fact, how people can influence the landscape. And I want to suggest that anybody hearing my voice, watching me speak, can influence the landscape. In this case, it was a man named Charles Blockley, a historian, an African-American professor at Temple University, who got a grant and argued for and got up some 65 or 75 historical markers that particularly treat African-American history, including some tough subjects in and around Philadelphia. But in Alabama, it's a matter of state policy. And it turns out that the director of tourism in Alabama for at least the last 10 years has been African-American. Alabama says black folks spend the same color of money as everybody else, and we want to have them come and see. And what do we have to offer? We have a lot of history. So there's some terrific historical markers in Alabama. And having seen them on the landscape myself, for instance, there's good markers for the church at which Martin Luther King preached, which is right opposite the State House in downtown Montgomery. There's good markers for the events in Selma, Alabama. There's just pretty good markers treating the civil rights era in particular. So I asked one of the people in charge of historical markers in Alabama, have you had any trouble because of any of these markers? Has anybody opposed them? Thinking that, you know, some of the leftover Ku Klux Klan strata might have given them some trouble. He said only one, and the one that they had trouble with was a historical marker that on one side said a whole bunch of stuff about the surrender of the state capital, Montgomery, to General Wilson, the United States cavalry leader who had an enormous cavalry force and who took Montgomery in 1865. And the marker says that on one side, and it used to say on the other side, a biography of General Wilson. And this biography read kind of like a phone book. I mean, it said, General, I forgot his first name, so-and-so Wilson, B, you know, born, such and such a date, graduated WPT, 1854, whenever it was, you know, and then gave his career in terms of his promotions and previous battles. There was the word extraordinary at one point, but otherwise it was just a biography, you know, with almost no... It was the biography that bothered, and the people that bothered were the sons of Confederate veterans today. And I said, well, how come? And they said, well, they just were bothered by the idea that we would put up the biography of a Union general. It's as if it's a role model. So they actually forced or prevailed upon the state to move that marker to the edge of town to where the surrender happened. And at the state capitol where the marker had been, they put it back up the side that talked about the surrender of Montgomery on both sides, so it has the same text on both sides. It was the biography that bothered people. No trouble with the civil rights memorials, no trouble with the monuments that treat black subjects. So you never know what's going to give the trouble. Again, in Pennsylvania, I asked, have you had any trouble with any of your markers? They have a tough new marker, for instance, about a place in Philadelphia that used to be a slave mart. Now, the slave sales are almost never talked about on the landscape. We have all these plantations that are very nice. Everybody lived happy lives on the plantation, but the idea of buying and selling slaves, you can't make that seem nice, even though the plantation wasn't either. But so here we have this tough marker, no problem. The problem that the markers are in Pennsylvania, the marker that's a problem, is the marker that's about Little League, because there's two different people that claim that they invented Little League in the town of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and one of them gets credit on the marker and the other one keeps threatening to blow it up or do something bad to it. Good question. Are there any other questions? Yes?
I keep seeing arguments among people about whether there is a secret code for horse statues. I don't know if you covered that or not.
Yes, I don't talk about it, but I know the answer to that. The assertion is something like this: if they've got all 4 feet on the ground, fine. If they've got 1 foot raised, then the person was wounded or something like that. And if they've got 2 feet raised, the person was killed at that site, right? Yeah. It turns out that it's not true. The sculptors did what they wanted to do. So we've got lots of examples of folks with, I don't know if there's very many horses with 3 feet raised, and I can pretty much guarantee there's none with 4 feet raised, but the sculptors did what they wanted to do. Let me just segue to that really briefly. Sculptors do what they want to do on some other matters too. One of the ways that women get left off the landscape, a subject we haven't talked about, but that is treated in lives across America. But one of the ways they get left off is that female horses get left off. Now, I submit to you that in warfare, a mare and a stallion, being ridden by generals or whatever, do pretty much the same thing. We can't argue that them women just weren't presidents, you know, like the men were, and so it's fair enough that they get left off. And so there are famous examples, and one of them is right here in Washington, D.C., and he's pictured in the book. General Winfield Scott is in Scott Circle. Of course, we have people on horseback all over Washington, D.C. And Scott's favorite horse was a mare, and in this case, the sculptor made the horse a mare. But in this case, the family was outraged, and they said, well, it's just not manly to have him on a mare. So the sculptor said, well, okay, and he added the appropriate accoutrements. And I took a picture of all this with the setting sun behind it in the west so that the accoutrements are visible. The most hilarious case of this anywhere in America has to be the case of General John, I forget his middle name, John Morgan in Louisville. Because John Morgan's favorite horse was again a mare, Bess. And in this case, the sculptor wouldn't have it. I think he was Italian, and he didn't think it was manly to have the general on a female horse. So he made the horse a male. So you've got this horse with everything a male horse should have, and the base says General John H. or whatever it was, Morgan, and his Bess, B-E-S-S. And it turns out that there's a long tradition of the fraternity kids at the nearby University of Kentucky painting Bess's unfortunate male appendages bright neon colors throughout the school year. And there's a poem been written about this, and all of this is in my book. I even add to the, let's see if I can find what I add to the poem quickly enough. It's just doggerel anyway, and any reasonable person. Here we are, though. Okay. The poem goes, so sorrow comes to bluegrass men like darkness o'er them falls. For well we know gentlemen should show respect for a lady's balls. And I add, there's other lines, but I add this quatrain. How can women take their place in history in due course when monuments don't even let a lady be a horse? Yes.
In the first book, Liza, my teacher told me you talked about John Brown, and I wondered if you, because I haven't gone to the John Brown house in Harper's Ferry, but I've heard that there's some interesting things. Or like I think there's like a plaque from the Daughters of the Confederacy to one of the slaves who was responsible for turning into. I wish you could talk about that.
Yes. John Brown is treated on the landscape in several places in America, and of course John Brown did stuff in several places in America. I don't treat Harper's Ferry in Lies Across America, and the reason I don't is because Harper's Ferry, I think, is a pretty good site. And I'm thinking about writing some kind of sequel to Lies Across America, and in a way it might even be a sequel to Lies my teacher told me, that might be called something like Surprises on the Landscape, places that actually get history right. And Harper's Ferry might be one of them. At Harper's Ferry, if you go there right now, you see what I call the duel of the plaques. You see 3 different plaques. One of them is the plaque you're talking about, a plaque put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who put up, of course, the monument to the Confederacy in Helena, Montana, and who have put up errors on the landscape all across the United States. Well, at Harper's Ferry, they put up a plaque that celebrates Haywood Shepherd, who was the free African-American, or quasi-free, who was one of the, and possibly the, first people killed by John Brown's men in the seizure of the armory at Harper's Ferry, what is now West Virginia, in 1859. Well, this was a tragedy, and too bad. It's probably the only African-American that the United Daughters of the Confederacy celebrate anywhere across America, and of course they're celebrating him and his death for ideological reasons, because this shows how outrageous John Brown was. Well, for many years, this plaque was covered over with plywood by the National Park Service, but now they've uncovered it, partly because of pressure from the Sons of Confederate Veterans. But they have put next to it their own plaque that interprets this plaque and tells more about the event and quotes W.B. Du Bois and does a pretty good job of telling some history. So that's the second plaque. And the third plaque is put up on the armory itself, built into the armory, and it's put up by Storer College, which was a black college that deliberately chose to locate at Harper's Ferry, partly because they honored what John Brown had tried to do there. It went out of business after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court desegregation decision. But when it was in business, back in about 1918 or so, they put up a plaque that is sacred to the memory of John Brown and his 18 or 23, depending on how you count them, followers. And it goes on to say positive things about John Brown. So you've got the positive, the negative, and the interpretive by the National Park Service. I think that's great. You know, I think there's a lot of history going on there. I do have another entry about John Brown that treats John Brown's farm. And I won't tell you about it. I would suggest you look for it in the book. Because John Brown's farm up in upstate New York, where he is buried now, where John Brown's body lies, does a terrible disservice to his name, and it's a real shame. One more question.
What's the quality of sort of the historicity or the historical scholarship in these various state places? Is it just political jobs, or are there real scholars at work trying to write this stuff?
It varies a lot by state, and it's gotten better. The disastrous historical markers went up in the 1930s and maybe the 40s and even into the 50s and 60s. But in about the 70s, and I think it was partly a result of the civil rights movement, but not just about race relations, but in the 70s and 80s, they tended to appoint people who, if not historians, at least cared about history. And many of the states now have a commission that, and it's just a one-person office maybe, or a two-person office, but then there's a commission or a board that has to vet and approve any new historical marker. And so you do have to prove these things. You know, you have to, the airplane in Texas wouldn't get up today because you can't prove that it ever flew. They're not doing much of a job of taking them down, although there is some movement in that regard. In Virginia, I have a late entry, it's kind of a theoretical entry I call snowplow revisionism, because in Virginia they had a terrible marker, talked about last Indian outrage, and didn't tell much history, but it certainly conveyed that we were outraged by those Indians. And it got hit by a snowplow a few years ago, or by a mowing machine. There's a controversy about what hit it. And when they put it back up, it didn't say last Indian outrage anymore. Now it said last Indian settler conflict, which is much more accurate. And the paragraph below was much more accurate and told much more history too. And Virginia, it turns out, has a program. They don't even always wait for snowplows to replace some of their worst markers. The same thing is going on in Kansas. Colorado is talking about such a program and may have it in place by now. So there is some movement by these professionals to get better marker texts up. But nonetheless, it's still a matter of pressure on them. And I know this, for instance, because in Michigan, and I already said that Michigan has some of the best markers in the U.S. They have a good marker for a strike at GM, for instance. It's a tough issue in Michigan. They have a good marker for Malcolm X, who grew up in Lansing, Michigan. But they have a terrible marker for Orville Hubbard, who was the mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, and the most outrageous segregationist north of the Mason-Dixon line, possibly one of the most outrageous in all of the U.S. He was a mayor for like 25 years or so. And his marker doesn't mention anything about what he was famous for. Instead, it says he was famous for good government and for punctual trash collection and so on. And at the time, the marker supervisor was an African-American woman. And I interviewed her and I said, how could this marker be so bad? And she said, well, it's all we could get up. So even in a state that does a professional job, there's still a question of the pressures on them. And I think they need to hear from the rest of us so that they put up some more accurate markers and revise some of these terrible ones. Again, thank you. I hope you all buy this hilarious and deeply sad book, and I'll sign any copies that you do buy, and there's also a few copies of Lies My Teacher Told Me around in the store. Thanks a lot. And you can come up and talk to me even if you don't buy a book.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
This is Nusha Benji. I work in international development in the Middle East, and I was curious if you had any suggestions on books that give like a concise sort of summary of sort of debunking myths about U.S. involvement in their American foreign policy in the Middle East or around the world. You know?
Yes, I do. One chapter of Lies My Teacher Told Me treats that kind of stuff. It's a chapter called Watching Big Brother, and it looks at what the government does and what we say about the government. But much bigger than that is a book by Jonathan Quick called, what is it called? Let's see if I have to, oh, I can't even look it up, it's not in that book. Endless, I know what it is, KWIT, Whitney, but it's called Endless Enemies. And you can hear right from the title what it's about almost. And Whitney's a very interesting writer because he's not anti-American, and he's certainly not anti-capitalism, but he's very much anti the antics, if you will, of our government in fomenting assassination attempts and so on around the world. So I'd start with that book.
Okay, and then when do you, like, how do you do your ongoing research? Like, it seems like you're someone who's interested in learning the truth about certain things.
I don't know how I do
current
it.
events and stuff?
I keep reading all the time, you know. I know how I did the research. Yeah, and books like Whitney's, you know, the web, but you have to check stuff out.
Yeah,
you know, you can't just believe everything, but.
James Lowen's previous book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, won the American Book Award and the Oliver Cromwell Cox Award for Anti-Racist Scholarship. His latest book, Lies Across America, is published by the New Press. Next week at this time, historians Stephen Ambrose and Douglas Brinkley